Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the last meeting of the Wagner Society of Scotland for this season, and to introduce Derek Williams, who is known to all of you as the chair of the society. Derek is on the associated staff of the University of Edinburgh as a lecturer, tutor in music. He's been orchestrator, composer, conductor and freelance musician for 27 feature films, television documentaries, mini-series with 33 recording credits, and has been a frequent conductor of orchestras such as the Victorian Philharmonic Orchestra, the East Lothian Festival Orchestra and many others. Many of the media to which he has contributed have gone on to achieve critical and popular acclaim, including the Los Angeles Film Festival, Indie Films, BAFTA, Best Film Scores, an Oscar, Platinum Record Sales and an Australian ARIA Award nomination. Derek's range of international clients has included Torval and Dean, Sir Robert Helpman, Cameron McIntosh and Carolyn O'Connor, and his work has been performed at the Royal Albert Hall and Garrick Theatre London and the Sydney Opera House. As a young chorister, he performed at the in Westminster Abbey, King's College, Cambridge, the White House and the Lincoln Center, New York. The world premiere of his full-length opera about Oscar Wilde will take place early next year with full orchestra and chorus at Edinburgh University's McEwan Hall, and we look forward greatly to this with anticipation. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll just call you all to arms. And as anyone who's been to Bayreuth will well know, that's what happens when you're called into the next opera. Well, in this case it was the next opera in The Ring. Now, the talk that I'm giving tonight is to explore what Wagner thought about houses and about Valhalla, whether Wahnfried and Valhalla could be deemed possibly synonymous in some way. And I'm going to play you something which you know very well, which I'm sure you see up there. Someone singing about home. it's just been built for them. It took quite a while to say, here's your home. And there's a little bit more music after this, and we'll come to how this home came to be built and whose idea it was and how it was paid for, which, as you know, the ring will know it was paid for with the gold. But we'll move to where the gold comes from in the real world of Wagner in a minute. So now we have Fricka explaining why she wanted the house. Concern over constancy. So greet I the home, safe from dismay and dread. Follow me, wife, into the Valhalla now with me. And here we have pictured Wotan, Fricka, Siegfried, and the Valkyries right on the back steps of Valhalla. You can see them a little bit closer. Recognize them? Cosima and Wagner at the back, and there's young Siegfried at the bottom, and a load of Valkyries. Now there's another sort of Valhalla which you mightn't be aware of. It's in Australia. In Norse mythology, Valhalla is an enormous, majestic hall of the slain, ruled over by the god Odin, who of course is Wotan and Delusions Have Found Peace. Many monuments and towns are called Valhalla, including this little town in Australia, shown in 1906. There's also a railway station where an unfortunate train accident occurred, so that's called Valhalla as well. There's bad things seem to happen in Valhalla. The Valhalla Memorial in Regensburg in Bavaria is a hall of fame that honours distinguished people in German history who are drawn both from Greater Germany and from as far away as Britain. It's a neoclassical monument above the Danube River. It was conceived in 1807 by the then Crown Prince Ludwig I and was constructed after his accession in 1825. Here's the debonair young prince getting ready to sit on the throne. And between 1830 and 1842, this was built under the architect Leo von Klenzel, whom we'll hear more about in a minute, to support the unification of the German states. To get from Bayreuth to Regensburg, or vice versa, it's an hour and a half drive, so it's quite possible Wagner would have seen that Valhalla. Another building commissioned by Ludwig I was the Ruhmeshalle. The Valhalla displays plaques and busts covering over 2,000 years of history, beginning in 9 AD, and a notable feature of Klenz's Valhalla was its iron roof, materially used elsewhere supposedly as a fireproof construction measure after the Munich Court and National Theatre burned down in 1823, only 5 years after its construction. You wouldn't think that iron was a very good fire retardant, but there it is. In fact, I'm sure you've heard of the very unfortunate fire in Glasgow. The School of Arts burned down again after being rebuilt. A neoclassicism like this was drawn from 16th century Renaissance classicism and began halfway through the 18th century. And the neoclassicism, I should say, in a popular rejection of the dominant Baroque and Rococo architectures, which emphasized asymmetry, grace, and ornamentation. Neoclassical architecture is based on symmetry and simplicity, both of which are seen as virtues in ancient Greek and Roman arts. Ludwig I's passion for Hellenism was further realized when his second son, Otto I, became the first modern king of Greece in 1832 under the Convention of London, which had been convened to create a stable government in Greece. Otto reigned until 1862 when he was deposed and died 5 years later. And let's come back to the Ruhmeshalle again. In Munich, Ludwig commissioned an additional Hall of Fame for Bavarians, and that was in 1853, the Ruhmeshalle, a Doric colonnade with a main range and 2 wings, also designed by von Klenze. He's a very busy architect, and you can see magnificent buildings. Now, Beneficent Shrinees whose busts were destroyed in 1944 during World War II have since been repatriated to Valhalla as new busts. A plaque in the Ruhmeshalle with their names tells us that they're transferred to the new location. Ludwig I himself is also enshrined both at Ruhmeshalle and Valhalla. An ardent admirer of ancient Greece and the Italian Renaissance, Ludwig patronised the arts as commissioner of many neoclassical buildings. In addition to the Valhalla Temple and the Ruhmeshalle, he also commissioned the Befreiungshalle, the Villa Ludwigshöhe, the Pompeianum, the Ludwigstrasse, the Bavaria statue, and the Glyptothek, the old and new Pinakothek. His architecturally von Klenze and Friedrich von Wagner also strongly influenced the cityscape of modern Athens during the reign of Otto when he was king of Greece. The term Greek revival was used in 1842 by Professor Charles Cockerell to define the Hellenistic architecture movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, predominantly in Northern Europe and the United States, in a lecture he gave as Professor of Architecture to London's Royal Academy of Arts. And that was in 1842. The taste for Greek furniture and interior design known as Neo-Greek was at its peak by the beginning of the 19th century. The Greek revival architecture also took a different course in a number of countries, including continuing until the American Civil War and later still in Scotland. I see a lot of Greek influence here in Edinburgh. In the late 1760s and early 1780s, a proto-romantic movement in German literature and music had sprung up known as Sturm und Drang, or loosely and conventionally translated as storm and stress. Extremes of emotion and subjectivity were given free rein against the Enlightenment's perceived constraints of rationalism. In a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, aristocratic norms, science, and modernity, 19th century Romanticism was also characterized by emphasis on individualism and emotion, as well as glorification of all the past and of nature, with an emphasis on the medieval. We'll see where that comes up with the Gothic revival in a minute. Its influence was most strongly evident in literature, music, and the visual arts. It was felt across conservatism, radicalism, liberalism, and one of Romanticism's enduring legacies, nationalism, that would ultimately redraw the map of Europe. German revolutions of 1848 to 49 were initially part of the revolutions of 48 that broke out in many European countries. There were a series of rebellions in the states of the German Confederation and the Austrian Empire. The revolutions highlighted popular discontent with the autocratic political structure of the Confederation's 39 independent states that inherited the former Holy Roman Empire. The working class was seeking radical improvements to their living and working conditions, while the middle class were committed to liberal principles. This paradoxically split the revolution, thereby allowing the conservative aristocracy ultimately to defeat it. Liberals who were forced into exile to escape persecution became known as the 48ers, many of whom fled to the United States. In Bavaria, King Ludwig I had tried to institute a few minor reforms, but they failed to quell the protests. And on March the 16th in 1848, he abdicated in favour of his eldest son, Maximilian II. Maximilian I being the first king of Bavaria after all the margraves and duchies and all the other kinds of methods of subduing the population of Bavaria had been tried. He complained that he couldn't rule any longer, and he didn't want to give up his powers. He said in order not to become a slave, he had to become a lord. No other German ruler abdicated during the 1848 revolutions, and while some popular reforms were introduced, the government eventually managed to regain full control. Now this was built by King Maximilian. This is in a neo-Gothic style that differed markedly from the Greek revival architecture we've just seen. It was favoured by Ludwig I. The Hohenschwangau Castle was the childhood residence of none other than King Ludwig II. And this is a closer view of the castle. You see there, it's the same. You see the previous one, it's the same one closer up. And there you see King Max. Unlike his father Ludwig I and his son Ludwig II, King Max was a popular monarch who took far less interest in personal extravagance than either his father or his son, and a great deal more interest in government. He reigned for 16 years between 48 and 1864. Maximilian restored stability in the Bavarian kingdom, having ascended to the throne during the German revolutions. He attempted to maintain Bavarian independence during the wars of German unification and to develop Munich into a capital city of culture and education. September of 1848 also marked the first stage of the creation of the world's greatest operatic masterpiece, when Wagner wrote the poem for Siegfried's Tod, a three-act heroic opera that would eventually become Götterdämmerung, that concludes the Ring des Nibelungen tetralogy. The May Uprising took place in Dresden, in the Kingdom of Saxony in 1849. It was one of the last of the revolutions of 48. The year had begun with 3 articles by Wagner dwelling on the need for theatrical reform, published in the revolutionary Volksblätter. However, by April he was calling for outright revolution in a prose poem anonymously published in this magazine. By the 3rd of May, the pealing church bells signalled the start of the revolt, and for the next 6 days, Wagner remained near the centre of the action until the uprising was crushed on the 9th of May, after being 6 days, although he later denied this for reasons that we know only too well. Afterwards, as we know, he had to escape from Germany to Zurich, and contrary to Minna's wish, she wanted to remain in Dresden. By July, though, she wrote to Wagner saying she would join him in Switzerland, only under sufferance. However, by 1850, she had become anxious for Wagner to return to Paris. Meanwhile, a re-energized Wagner continued writing voluminously, rapidly completing Art and Revolution in July, followed in November by the Artwork of the Future. Art and Revolution lays out his ideas for the Gesamtkunstwerk, as we know, as all kinds of art brought together into a single work, likened to the all-encompassing drama of ancient Greece, derived from the Vogue, from the people who Wagner envisaged would be its true creators. Wagner's love for satin and velvet, with the scent of exotic bath oils floating up from the bathroom below, didn't stop him raging against mankind's crazy appetite for luxury in the Artwork of the Future. Meanwhile, a series of Gothic revivals that had begun in the mid-18th century England spread through the 19th century Europe and continued largely for university and ecclesiastical structures until the 20th century. When you have a look here, you can see the left-right comparison. On the left, you see the Grecian simple columnar structured buildings with a grand portico at the start. On the right-hand side, you see the castellated appearance of the buildings in the Gothic style. Gothic architecture originally flourished in Europe during the Middle Ages from 1000 to 1250 AD, continuing through the late Middle Ages, which ended around 1500. An example of the high Gothic style is Rheims Cathedral, built in France from the 13th to the 14th century. They didn't seem to worry too much if they weren't alive when they started these things by the time they finished them. A huge enterprise. So the Gothic style evolved from Romanesque architecture and was succeeded by Renaissance architecture. Its characteristics include the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, which evolved from the joint vaulting of Romanesque architecture, and the flying buttress. It is most familiar as the architecture of many of the great cathedrals, abbeys, castles, palaces, town halls, guild halls, and universities. Recognise that one? Mm-hmm. Very nearby, Glasgow University. It was in the great cathedrals and civic buildings that the Gothic style was used to greatest effect, and many buildings of architectural distinction remain from this period. Some of the larger churches are considered priceless works of art and are now listed with UNESCO as World Heritage Sites. This was the style favoured also by Ludwig II, born Louis Otto Frederick William on the 25th of August 1845, sometimes also known as the Swan King, the Mad King, or the Fairy Tale King. He was also Duke in Swabia, Duke of Bavaria, Duke of Franconia, and Count Palatine of the Rhine, and succeeded to the Bavarian throne in 1864, aged just 18. a very snappy dresser, if I may say so, Your Majesty. On May the 4th, 1864, the by then 51-year-old Wagner was given an extraordinary audience with Ludwig in the Munich Royal Palace, lasting an unprecedented 1 3/4 hours. Now this meeting Wagner later wrote, "Alas, he is so handsome and wise, soulful and lovely, that I fear his life must melt away in this vulgar world like a fleeting dream of the gods." Already thinking of gods. A year after meeting the king, Wagner presented Tristan und Isolde in Munich to great acclaim, but his scandalous and extravagant behaviour proved unsettling for the conservative Bavarians, and so 6 months later the king had to ask him to leave the city. No small thing to ask such a big fan as Ludwig II to do. At one point Ludwig even considered abdicating so he could follow Wagner, but Wagner persuaded him to stay for entirely selfless reasons. And so from 1866 to 1872, Ludwig provided the residence at Tribschen. It's quite a lovely home there, but quite box-like. It's rectilinear, isn't it? You can see the pointed top, and it's like a biscuit box for the roof. But, still very nice, and the view, the aspect is really something. And that was so that Wagner and his growing family could live safely in Switzerland. And there he is with little Eva. I don't know if you recognise Eva, but that's her. She recognised Wagner. Die Meistersing was completed there and was premiered in Munich in 1868. When Wagner returned to his ring cycle, Ludwig demanded special previews of the first two works, Das Rheingold and Die Walküre, in Munich in 1869 and 1870, much against Wagner's wishes. As you know, he wanted to finish the piece before he put it on and didn't want to be putting bits of it out and possibly spoiling the effect. In the Franco-Prussian War, I should say, as far as I know, there wasn't a war between France at that point, although there was one, Bonaparte, okay. Anyway, but Bavaria became part of the new German Empire led by Prussia. Though Bavaria retained some autonomy with the new German Reich, after 1871 Ludwig started to withdraw from politics, devoting himself increasingly to an array of creative projects, most notably his castles, for which he personally approved every detail of the location, architecture, furnishing and decoration. Among these projects were two lavish palaces and the Romanesque revival Neuschwanstein castle, built as a home for himself and as a retreat for Richard Wagner, for whom he became an increasingly devoted patron. Now here we have the first envisioning of the castle Neuschwanstein, and then we see it being built. On the left you see the built part, on the right you see the being built part. And here we see the completed. It's like Disneyland, it's a phenomenal building. And you can see a landscape view, that this stupendous view is just absolutely breathtaking. Anyone ever been there? Have you been to Neuschwanstein?
Yeah.
The basic style was originally planned to be neo-Gothic, which was Ludwig's preferred style, but in the end the palace was built primarily in Romanesque style. Its walls are adorned with frescoes of scenes from Wagner's operas, including Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, Die Meistersinger, Tristan und Isolde, and Parsifal. Here's a little sample of some of the rooms. Imagine waking him up and there in the morning. Well, that's dining room, I think. It seems to be. It's quite a stairway, isn't it? I love what you've done with the place, I'm sure. And that's a nice little bedroom. The least significant part of that room is the bed. And there's a little grotto downstairs, I suppose it's for the Nibelungen to hide. Ludwig's great interest in building followed that of his paternal grandfather, Ludwig I, who had practically rebuilt Munich. And his father, Maximilian II, who also continued development in Munich and commissioned the Hohenschwangau Castle, the one I said before, which is Ludwig II's childhood home, near his future Neuschwanstein. They went that far apart, the two castles. Ludwig's plan to build a large opera house on the banks of this Isar was vetoed, however, by the Bavarian government. Apparently they could veto Ludwig, not always successfully. But using similar plans, Wagner's Bayreuth Festspielhaus and Wahnfried were eventually built from his personal finances. Ludwig had initially refused to support the grandiose Festspielhaus project. However, when Wagner exhausted all other resources, he appealed to Ludwig, who gave him 100,000 thalers, T-H-A-L-E-R-S. That's the probable origin of the word dollar in the currency at the time. show you more about this currency in a minute so you can figure out what that's actually worth nowadays. On top of the 100,000 Wagner had already raised himself, it's no mean feat. With conducting gigs and personal fundraising enterprises, he got together 100,000 on his own. But to complete the work, Ludwig eventually attended the dress rehearsal and the third public performance of the complete ring cycle in 1876. Between 72 and 1885, the king had 209 private performances given either for himself alone or with a guest in the two court theatres comprising 44 operas, of which 28 were by Wagner, including 8 performances of Parsifal, 11 ballets and 154 plays at a total cost of 97,300 marks. We'll hold on to that number and you'll figure out how many pounds that would be in the day. The young king had complained that he couldn't get no sense of the illusion of theatre so long as people kept staring at him and following his every expression through their opera glass. He said, I want to look at myself, not be a spectacle for the masses. Others, he wanted to see it without people watching him watching the show. It can be hard to fathom all these units of currency, so here we are. Is that easier for you? Here are the currencies. A thaler is equal to 30 silvergroschen. 1 silvergroschen equals 12 pfennig, which is like a penny. Prussian thaler is equal to the Vereins thaler. I think there was an exchange rate for that. And a gold mark, 3 gold marks equals 1 Vereins thaler. 1 gulden equals a florin. We've even had florins here, which is 2 shillings. In fact, shilling itself is a German word. 1.75 gulden is 1 Vereins thaler. So it's a pretty dodgy kind of conversion, isn't it? Gulden equals 60 kreuzer, 4 pfennig or 8 heller, and that's in southern Germany. British pound sterling equals 20 gold marks. So if you can reverse calculate all that, then you'll know how much 100,000 thalers is. And I willingly defer to the numismatists among us to give an equivalent for the error. But 1 British pound equals 20 gold marks. While Ludwig didn't use state funds for all his projects, he spent all his royal revenues on them, borrowing heavily, both locally and sometimes from other royal houses, despite attempts by his ministers to restrain him. This profligacy was eventually used to declare him insane. While Ludwig didn't use, at one point Ludwig had considered replacing his entire cabinet, but they decided to act first. The conspirators put together a medical report accusing him of a very interesting list of dining outdoors in cold weather, wearing heavy overcoats in summer, sloppy and childish table manners, sending servants on expensive voyages to research architectural details in foreign lands, abusive and violent threats to servants, you might have something there, avoidance of state business, yes, expensive flights of fancy, yes, pathological shyness. That's apparently you're insane if you're pathologically shy. I suppose the word pathological is a bit of a clue. The team of medical experts engaged to write this had never actually met the king. And after reading the report, Otto Bismarck said, the ministers wished to sacrifice the king, otherwise they had no chance of saving themselves, and suggested that the matter be brought before the Bavarian Diet, in other words, the parliament. Nevertheless, that did not stop the ministers, and the king was eventually declared unfit to rule. Despite his ignominious fall from power, Ludwig II's architectural and artistic legacy now includes Bavaria's most important tourist attractions. One of Ludwig's most quoted sayings was, I wish to remain an eternal enigma to myself and to others. Upon his death in 1886, Neuschwanstein was opened to the public, and more than 61 million people have visited the castle, with over 1.3 million visits annually and up to 6,000 per day in the summer. So he was thinking way ahead. He'd be rich on the door takings by now, I'm sure. Ludwig was almost certainly the saviour also of Wagner's career, and without him it is questionable whether Wagner's later operas would either have been premiered at the prestigious Munich Royal Court Theatre, now the Bavarian State Opera, or even composed at all. We have a little listen to, oh sorry, I've just got a bit back.
I must have been 11 or 12 when I first heard Wagner's music on my father's gramophone.
It was the overture to Tannhäuser, one of his earlier operas. And it did something most extraordinary to me. I've always loved music. I've always been hopeless at performing it. Couldn't really play an instrument, certainly can't sing, but it's made me do things inside. It's released forces within me. And no music has done it like Wagner's.
To experience the music I love in the composer's own theatre is something I've dreamed of doing for as long as I can remember. But it's no secret that my passion was also shared by him. And like me, he felt the magnetic pull of Bayreuth. I'm Jewish and lost relatives in the Holocaust, so before I take my seat in the Festspielhaus, I need to feel sure I'm doing the right thing. To understand why this place exerts such a powerful hold on all of us who've loved Wagner's music, you need to understand what it meant to the composer himself. It's a million miles away from the type of theatre where his career began.
This is everything Wagner detested about opera, a place to show off, to be seen, a place to whisper and talk and stare across at your rivals and neighbours and social betters and social inferiors and all the snobbery and nonsense that still pertains in so much of opera, of course. Wagner hated all that. But it's funny. Lust, isn't it?
Now for the last time, the longing motif comes back. Chromatic scale going upwards, leading.
Finally, that E is going to come off to the
transition to transcendence. Just a moment.
Oh, I played the wrong note.
It's not so easy.
It's not.
The piano playing.
I get overexcited. But my goodness, to have been even a small part of it. Yes. You've made me the happiest man in Germany today.
There's nothing to say.
No, there is nothing to say. That's
It's,
exactly the point.
Extremely good music.
By 1864, Wagner's life had reached its lowest ebb. He was no longer a young firebrand in danger of being imprisoned for his revolutionary politics. He was a 50-year-old in danger of being imprisoned for his simply astonishing debt. He'd written Tristan, but that had been declared unproducible by most people who had seen it or tried to rehearse it. His relationship with Mathilde Wiesendonck was over, his marriage was over. It seemed his career was over, all that bright promise. And how could he possibly give the world these preposterously ambitious music dramas? If he were to write a wish list, I suppose he'd come up with one thing. He would need someone so powerful, so extraordinarily rich, that they could write off his debts, they could build him the theatre he wanted, they could guarantee him the posterity that he knew his genius merited. But that would be asking for a miracle. On March the 10th, 1864, a miracle happened. Quite unexpectedly, Maximilian II, King of Bavaria, died. He left his opulent kingdom to his son Ludwig, a handsome, eccentric 18-year-old. And one of Ludwig's first actions on acceding to the throne was to send for his hero, the artist he most adored in all the world, Richard Wagner.
Wagner was so used to fleeing the debt collector that it took Ludwig's messenger some time to track him down with the good news. The king was offering to pay off all his debts and bankroll his future work. And if that wasn't proof enough of his passion, Ludwig went on to build what must surely be the world's most extravagant fan letter. Schloss Neuschwanstein wasn't completed until 1886, 3 years after Wagner's death, so he never had a chance to wander through these extraordinary spaces, all inspired by his work. But he had something better, the king's blank check. After years of struggle and disappointment, Wagner's dreams of artistic freedom must finally have seemed attainable.
What a patron to have.
No one ever built something like this for Mozart or Beethoven. So what is it about Wagner's music which inspires some men to seize on his stories and ideas, things which belong in the theatre, and seek to give them substance in the real world instead? By the time he finished work on the Master Singers, there was a new woman in Wagner's life. Cosima, the daughter of his friend Franz Liszt. They married in 1870 after a scandalous affair which almost cost him Ludwig's patronage. This was the bait that brought Wagner to Bayreuth. Do you remember it? The Baroque Rococo extravagance which is the Margravial Opera House. Wagner had resumed work on the Ring Cycle and was searching for a suitable theatre to stage it in. A helpful friend suggested this place might fit the bill. Some friend. But Wagner liked Bayreuth, conveniently situated at the heart of his royal patron's Bavarian kingdom. So, if the perfect theatre didn't already exist here, why not build one instead?
These are the original plans for the Festspielhaus,
Yes,
which are constructed by Otto Brückwald.
And someone's written here.
Yeah, that's very nice. You
the
see,
Ornamenta Fort.
Yes.
Is that Wagner's hand?
Yes, this is original Wagner's hand. He got the plans from the architect, and you can see he had the idea to make some ornaments and
Typical late
Baroque.
19th century kind of.
Yes,
Yeah,
and Wagner
yes, Baroque
wrote the
revival.
Ornamenta Fort.
Yeah.
Away with the ornaments. Yes.
Some of the cash came from Ludwig, the rest from private donations. And the city of Bayreuth gifted him the green hill to build on. Here's the boss, one of them anyway, Eva Wagner, the composer's great-granddaughter. She's recently taken charge of the festival alongside her sister Katerina.
So this is your first month here, almost, isn't it? You're a new girl.
It's, well, I lived here before, but now I'm a new person here, yes.
Yeah.
In
So
a new position.
it must be a very
back-
strange feeling.
Back home.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think of Bayreuth as your home?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't answer that. You know, I was a long time away, but I mean, I like it.
Yeah.
And,
You ever get a chance to relax and think yet? Not.
not really yet. I think that will be probably after the festival when I have my
'Cause
holiday.
this is June when the whole thing starts building to an enormous climax.
Exactly.
I suppose a very pathetic, vulgar question is, but do you think he would be surprised that Bayreuth is still going strong and that people still, it's now what, 7 years waiting
He
list
would
for a
be
ticket?
surprised.
Do you think, or would he
Why?
expect that? No, he knew he was going to live forever.
course.
Yeah, he did,
I'm
didn't
sure. Otherwise, why should he have built it
he?
here?
It's true.
You know,
It's still astonishing, isn't it, that you to have.
that is a very special thing about here,
Yeah.
about him, about the music,
Yeah. And
the person.
And so you know also that means it's a bit like being an aristocrat. You know that you are borrowing, as it were, your time from your children. You know what I mean? That they, or
Well-
I don't mean literally your children, but the next generation and the generation after that will do
I
new
think
things.
You create something in your mind, which is perhaps not.
No? You don't feel that?
No, I don't feel.
You
that.
don't feel
No.
the idea of posterity, as we would say in England, the future. No, you
Not
just,
at the moment.
you-
I
that's,
mean, I have.
that's probably
you know,
good. You
I
get
have-
on with the present.
I live now and I do my things now, and I hope to do it, you know, like people want it and expect it.
Yeah.
With Katharina, you know, with my sister.
Yeah.
And I think hopefully we are a good team.
I'm sure.
I think so.
Does it-
Okay.
that's really
Is
nice
that
talking to you.
okay?
It's a
Because
fantastic. No, I
have to
appreciate it. You are very,
Thank you.
yeah,
Bye-bye.
very busy. Thank you so
Bye.
much. Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Hey, but could you stay still or not?
Yeah, we'll be here for the next 3 days. So.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Flesh on flesh, I touched a Wagner. I know that's pathetic of me, but it's rather wonderful.
So, now this is where Wagner was born, as Richard Geyer. And there's still some question about paternity, as whether Geyer or Wagner indeed were his father. Was his father. From his birth in Leipzig in 1813, Wagner always seemed connected in some way with architecture. Involuntarily at first as a child, when no one chooses which house they're going to be born in, and then by design as his career blossomed. Life for the young Richard Geyer began here. His childhood was beset by domicile changes brought about as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, family disputes, and following his mother. The impact of these dwellings ranged from the traumatic to the aesthetic, and this scarcely improved as his music career progressed, in the course of which his rental accommodation varied according to his income, and sometimes beyond his income. At this time, he appears to be more interested in the comfort and location. Irrespective of whether or not he could afford it, he stayed at the newest and best hotels. One might marvel at the socio-economical state of 19th century composers' birthplaces, over which, of course, as I said, I had no control whatsoever. This is Brahms' birthplace. I'm not sure what architect had anything to do with it, but probably just thrown together. But he still managed to become a very successful composer despite being born there. Then we have quite another rectilinear building in the place of Robert Schumann's place, that's where he was born. The dwellings of twilight years are probably cause for envy by the likes of Strauss, who in 1906 built himself a mountain villa not unlike Triebschen in aspect, but nowhere near the grandeur of Wahnfried. This is Strauss's mountain villa. That's where the where the Americans arrested him after the end of the end of the Second World War. Yes, they didn't arrest him in the First World War. The progression of fortune is evident in the dwellings of Mahler, from this where he wrote his first symphony, another box-like rectilinear structure, to this, his summer villa, still box-like, but lots more bits added on. Now you might not be aware from looking at that, but it's actually on the side of a lake, so I'm going to take you out to the lake and see there it is from the distance. That's his summer villa in Lake Watersea in the Austrian village of Malenbeek. It was built in 1901. That piece similarly box-like to the rectilinear dimensions of Wahnfried in comparison to the sprawling neo-Gothic grandeur of the Neuschwanstein, which we saw before. And all indicate their owners comfortably well off, yet none come close to Wagner's. If it was any consolation to the other jealous composers, envious of Wagner's sumptuous living circumstances, they at least had the satisfaction of knowing the bulk of his wealth was bestowed by the generous, reckless, and hopelessly devoted young monarch of Bavaria, Ludwig II. How did Wagner come to choose this sleepy country town of Bayreuth in the first place? He had first travelled through it in 1835 on his way from Karlsbad to Nuremberg and recalled afterwards, "The trip through Eger over the Fichtel Mountains and our entrance into Bayreuth, gloriously illuminated by the setting sun, long remained happy memories. Bayreuth had lost its margravial status in 1810 to join the Kingdom of Bavaria, but it wasn't until 1860 that the monarch in the person of Maximilian II visited the realm. He approved a railroad in 53 with lines added in 63 and 77, but there are no lines to the major cities. Well, no, at that time there were none. And here is a map of what Bayreuth looked like then. And this is what it looked like leading up to the Festspielhaus at the time that was built. So you can see it's very rustic sort of environment. After centuries of rule from AD 548 under a succession of duchies, electorates, margraves, and a period of Frankish rule, including Charlemagne, in 1805 the Peace of Pressburg Treaty between Napoleonic France and the Holy Roman Empire turned several duchies into kingdoms. From 1806, the Wittelsbach dynasty held the title King of Bavaria, starting with the Prince-Elector Maximilian IV Joseph, who at the beginning of 1806 became Maximilian I, so he became stopped being the fourth and became the first. Sort of bizarre right of succession. Ludwig II's excesses bankrupted the country, and by 1918, King Ludwig III had lost his throne in the German Revolution of 18 to 19 after the First World War. And here we see the flowery margravial opera house, which you just saw in the video there with Stephen Fry. It was the birth of Siegfried that gave Wagner the idea of his legacy. Before that, he was living from suitcase to suitcase. And Cosima wrote, "Now you will continue to live after your own death. You have a son. You will strive and have influence forever and ever. From then onwards, the Wagners kept everything for posterity. Photographs, books, letters, manuscripts." Wagner wrote, "When my son matures into a man, he should know exactly who his father was." This meant a permanent home was needed. And by 1870, Wagner was nearing completion of The Ring, intending to performance by 1872. Given the pressure Ludwig was putting on him, as we know it didn't happen then. In April 71, Richard and Cosima visited Bayreuth together for the first time, and the decision to set up domicile there was easily and rapidly made. All the more surprising given that Wagner wasn't sure even then that it would be possible to build his theatre there, and Ludwig wanted to premiere The Ring at Munich, not in Bayreuth. A meeting was duly held with the Berlin architect Wilhelm Neumann, and the king diverted 25,000 thalers originally intended for the Festspielhaus to construct instead of the villa Wahnfried, which we were about to see. And the site next to the Hofgarten was accordingly purchased on the 1st of February 1872. Cosima contributed 40,000 marks of her own money from her personal fortune to the building costs, and her individual touch was very evident throughout the interior. This is the plan of the whole site. You can see the house there, the rotunda. Should have a red pointer rotunda here, and there's the front steps, back steps, and there's the gardens. It's pretty much how it still has, well, now it's been restored. The role and purpose of the villa was sevenfold, I just counted them. A peaceful workplace to complete Goethe-Dämmerung and Parsifal, a command centre for a future festival, 20-25 minutes walk away. Welcoming space for visitors and guests, venue for auditioning singers, ideological centre for the master's followers, a burial place for Richard and Cosima Wagner, they were planning ahead, and a bequest for his children to continue the festival, which is what it turned out to be. Neumann also drew up initial plans for the Festspielhaus, making clear an early connection between the two buildings. However, after showing little interest in the projects, it was eventually fired. In fact, it was only around this time that the idea of purpose-built artist villas was starting to catch on. For example, the violinist Joseph Joachim had just acquired a luxurious villa built for him in 1870 in Berlin. We've already seen Strauss's mounted villa. Here, more of the plans, the side aspect of the plans for Wahnfried. And when the luxuriousness of the plans Norman had drawn up for what would later be called Wahnfried came to the notice of the king, Wagner played his next card by writing to tell the king to rescind the purchase and that he would go back to living in a rented apartment. Ludwig, ingenuously or otherwise, took the bait, since above all he wanted to keep Wagner in Bavaria. See any similarity? Do you recognize the building on the right? It's the Wesendonck villa, and on the left is one of the early plans for Wahnfried. There's a certain attempt to draw parallels. That's the next time. Nevertheless, more modest plans in keeping with the prevailing conditions in Bayreuth were drawn up, while up the Green Hill, which had been donated to the project by the town of Bayreuth, as we heard Stephen Price tell us, the foundation stone for Wagner's new theatre was laid in 1872 on May the 22nd. A week later, Karl Wölfel was appointed to take over the responsibility for future plans and building of the villa, and a different architect, Gottfried Semper, replaced Neumann as architect of the Festspielhaus, and here you see the Festspielhaus under construction. But it's funny, when you look at that, you think that that's now covered by a roof, and what it would be like to go pare back and see if it's still there. And here is the Semper. Despite Dresden being flattened by Allied bombing in World War II, Semper's design for the Dresden Opera still stands. There it is right there. It's spectacular, isn't it? And that's the same building viewed from the air. Under Wölfel, the village structure became more rectilinear with the removal of the veranda and the glasshouse. Nevertheless, it still looked pretty imposing for a small town like Bayreuth. The construction of Wahnfried was not, of course, without its problems. At one point, according to Cosima, Count Castel wanted to buy up all the access points to the Royal Hofgarten so the Wagners could never use it. But following strenuous efforts by Wagner to keep access, this was quickly thwarted by the king, who wrote in a royal communique, "I am minded to grant the composer Richard Wagner in Bayreuth permission to access from his property the adjoining Royal Hofgarten by means of a secure gate in the garden wall." Saying you were minded to do something meant it was effectively law. Now Wagner seemed to be thinking a lot more about his eventual death and legacy when he wrote to Ludwig that the birth of Siegfried had given his life new meaning, evident in this rare photo. Lovely photos. I showed that when I did the thing on the Third Reich. It's really, when you see Wagner with his kids, it's a different person. He just becomes human, all too human, as a certain philosopher might have said. And he wanted to create an archive and a home for his son. Consideration was given to one day separating the upper part of the house if Siegfried wanted to live there and close off the lower part. Circumstances, of course, changed when he married Winifred Williams and built the Siegfried house right next door. See that in a minute. Cosima oversaw much of the interior design with her intimate knowledge of salon culture, selected carpets, curtains and wallpapers, noting this in her diary in 1873. And I say one of the most valuable resources that you'll have here researching Wagner is the diaries of Cosima Wagner. Day by day, you know where they are and what they're doing. And I found that very helpful preparing for this. Is there some, here's what it looked like. It's funny, when you look at these photos, you think, well, they all lived in black and white rooms. It must be a very grey existence. But that's saying, just hold that in your mind and I'll show you what the room looks like today. It's the same room. And notice the ceiling is quite a lot less ornate because this is the area that was bombed and was rebuilt. But they copied from the original plans faithfully, millimetre by millimetre, the original design. That's now, the chairs have been set up. When I visited, those chairs weren't there, but they're going to give a lecture, they got them up again. Is there some propinquity between this and the neo-Gothic aspects of Neuschwanstein's interior, shown earlier? Well, Richard and Cosima asked for red silk curtains and a large rug laid directly on bare, I think you see it there, wooden floorboards. However, by the end of 1873, the relationship with Gedon, who was the interior designer, Berlin's leading interior designer, began to sour, as it had with Neumann, whom they had fired, and he partially withdrew from the project. Wagner and his family moved in on April the 28th, 1874, while the house was still under construction. This wasn't finished at that point. Engraved across the portal is Wagner's motto, "Hier, wo mein Wern Frieden fand, Wahnfried, sei dieses Haus mon wir benannt." Here my delusions have found peace. Let this place be named Wahnfried, which according to our founder, Derek Watson's account in his book, Derek Watson founded the Wagner Society, and in his book, Richard Wagner, a biography, caused great amusement among local townsfolk. At the time, we found the Wagner family quite perplexing. So they had quite a laugh at this name, Wahnfried. Picture postcards of the day celebrated Wahnfried more commonly than the Festspielhaus because of the name. But that has still to prove its worth, and here is the word Wahnfried with a nice engraving at the top of it. Wagner chose Wahnfried as a name for his Bavarian villa, which is a German compound of Wahn, delusion or madness, and Friede, peace or freedom, although Derek Watson prefers the word illusion as a contemporary translation for which the modern German is now Tolsham. On 18 April 74, Cosima wrote written in her diary, that was when they moved in, many treasures from the rich contents of mind and heart are now lost to this book forever. Since numbed by the shock and in any case overworked, I can only take up my pen again in the new house. The final happiness on the 29th. Isolated details I can still note down. Within the last few days, Richard had a strange dream about Mendelssohn, who did not wish to write something for Schroeder de Vries since she had not sung at his funeral. This is Wagner imagining his own funeral with a singer refusing to sing it. Then again and again, the old dream about Minna. This is her listening to him talking in his sleep, who was still alive. Minna Planer was actually dead by that point. She was Wagner's former wife who had died 6 years earlier in 1866. And Richard kept asking himself, my God, what's going to happen with Cosima? Well, she can't live forever, in his sleep. And with these words, he wakes up. The last letters I received in the old house are from my mother, and the former cannot send me my 40,000 francs. That's the money she needed to hand over to the building of Wahnfried. Moonlight, going out on the balcony, Richard and I see the grave. They go out and they see their own grave from the balcony. The final happiness, the end of my delusions. This painting in this particular diary entry that Cosima referred to is by Bruckner, not the composer, but the painter Heinrich Maximilian Bruckner, who in 1896 painted Valhalla. But I refer to Valhalla as being the Hall of the Slain, and this is his painting for the Ring production. So the same artist that originally conceived it as just an idea, and then he was commissioned to paint it for the actual performance in '96. By Sunday, May 3rd, Wagner declared himself happy with the house and said to Cosima, if anyone had told me that I should one day possess so dear and noble a woman, possessing a woman, how about that? Times have changed. In these comfortable surroundings, but I could kick myself for not being 15 years younger. A scene of marital and domestic bliss indeed, but was Wahnfried really the embodiment of Wagner's ideal home? And can a connection be drawn between Wahnfried and Valhalla? Tripschen had been the first place to afford Wagner a semblance of domesticity. He was sort of outside with young Evan, after a life spent running from creditors and from the police. And that meant there was a mountain of stuff to transport the new house, as recounted in Cosima's diary entries. The house ultimately became a home as much as a hub for the who's who were confined to the ground floor rooms. They were never invited upstairs. From the front entrance, the visitor enters the hall, and it's lit by a 10-metre glass ceiling by daylight and by radiant gilded cast iron gas lights at night, from which there were 3 double-winged doors in the classical style at the front, left and right. Those on the left led into Cosima's lilac salon, and those on the right to the dining room, and those in the centre, on the left there is to Cosima's room, and the centre is the one you see on the right there. I'll tell you about that piano in a second. And that's where Wagner's library and custom-built Steinway grand piano were situated. Nowadays, the hall supports Wagner's composition piano, and you can see on here, it's called a composition piano because he used it to write his operas. So this has got from A0 to A7, quite a large for a square piano, and that's the writing desk. So he put the score up there and write. He had a complete writing set there, and that's where the ring was constructed on that composition piano, built by the piano maker Bechstein. Wagner also had a Bechstein grand piano as well, and with Steinways when it was built for him. This is it, a bit closer up. So that survived the war. The good acoustics of the hall made it ideal for music making. In fact, it was the only place available for this when the Wagners moved in. As I mentioned, the grand salon was not yet finished. There was also a children's salon on the upper floor. The hall was used again in 1878 when the Duke of Meiningen was persuaded to grant his court orchestra 2 days' leave to play the prelude to Parsifal to mark Cosima's birthday, mirroring a similar episode with Siegfried Idel at Tribschen. Remember, the sun streaming in the orchestra there. Eventually, there were 3 grand pianos on the ground floor, with the stairway taking pride of place in the grand salon, probably in the rotunda where it is today. Here's the piano right there. And there's the same room, the same piano, with Wagner's several friends. I wouldn't begin to know who all those people are. And now if you swing around a little bit, you see, who's that person? And to the right of this, you see a bookshelf. Oh, it's moved again. So these books were rescued by Wahnfried Wagner when they knew the bombs was likely to hit the house. She was taking all the books out, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Here is another plan for the gardens. Wagner did not work in the grand salon, instead using a study upstairs right next to Siegfried's bedroom with the Bechstein composition piano he always worked with. The family generally lived in a sort of private paradise on the upper floor, which bore a semblance to their previous domestic life at Tribschen. At its heart was the 3-metre-high children's room, retained from the original Neumann plans, and this was when they received their daily education for long tables, sometimes with Richard and Cosima in attendance, taking breakfast or lunch, thus managing to fuse their bourgeois existence with the grand dwelling. It sounds less and less like Valhalla and more like home, doesn't it? No photographs and few descriptions survive of Cosima's lilac salon, nicknamed the ladies' room by Wagner. But contemporary records indicate it was decorated in blue as his gift to Cosima on the 9th of February. On the other hand, numerous images and detailed descriptions can be found for the grand salon's decor, furnishings, paintings, sculptures, books, and various social and work-related uses to which it was put. I think I'm getting a signal from John there to take a break. So if you'd like to go and get some wine, some fruit juice, whatever we serve up here in this sumptuous first floor accommodation. And we'll you can come back in about 15 minutes. How's our time, John? Outside the villa, there are extensive gardens, and that included kitchen gardens next to small outhouses and a glass house. Sometimes when guests were put there.
Can you finish up?
Oh yes, sure. Outside the villa were extensive gardens, and the family owned numerous pets, including a number of dogs and peacocks, and they held garden parties with beer on tap and humorous speeches by Wagner, notwithstanding the serious matter of his operatic composition. People who stayed, sometimes if the house was full, guests would stay in the outhouse, in the glass house, and they reported that being very comfortable. And Wagner would walk past and tap on the window and say hello to them. From 1875 onwards, a splendid Hermes bronze bust of the by then, much older king of Bavaria was in place on a pedestal directly in front of the villa's front door. The bust lacks the usual regalia of a monarch. In that sense, sets the tone of Wahnfried, which the whole property became known as. There's a bit of a story around the commissioning of the bust that originally was supposed to be in marble, and Wagner wrote in this very flattering tone saying he couldn't imagine a bust being made out of such a cheap substance as marble. And the only thing that would satisfy him is that it would be better not to have a bust at all. I just couldn't stand the idea of having a bust that was of cheap marble. So they commissioned this bronze thing and really wrote out the check. So Wagner certainly knew how to manipulate the very willing to be manipulated young monarch. Wagner didn't spend the closing days of his life at Wahnfried, instead leaving Bayreuth on the 6th of September 1882 for the 6th and final time for Venice, where he resided until his death from a heart attack on the 13th of February in 1883 at the Palazzo Vendramin Calergi. He had rented the entire mezzanine level. You go to a hotel, you rent the whole floor. I'll take that floor, thank you. That was Wagner. He rented the whole floor. for himself and his wife, along with their 4 children and household servants. It must have been quite a pack of them to take up a whole hotel floor. And here it is, as it looked then, and here it is as it looks now. Now, the palazzo was designed by Mauro Coduzzi, an Italian architect of the early Renaissance, active mostly in Venice. He was one of the first to bring the classical style of the early Renaissance to Venice to replace the Gothic style, which had prevailed across Europe since 1000 AD, as I mentioned. Currently, it is home to the Venice Casino, Casino di Venezia, and the Wagner Museum. They sit happily right next to each other. You can gamble your money away, just like the late Richard Wagner. The Wagner Museum, operated by the Stazione Richard Wagner di Venezia, opened at the palace in February 1995. It holds the largest private collection dedicated to Wagner outside of Bayreuth. Seems that you can get money out of a casino after all. The RWVI, which Dale and I and Tim are going to next week to represent the Wagner Society of Scotland in Innsbruck, in Austria. They hold a symposium there called Wagner Days in Venice at the palace each autumn. Upon his death, Wagner's body was repatriated to Wahnfried following a public procession through Bayreuth on the 18th of February, and his grave lies next to that of Cosimo on its ground. So here it is. Leading up to and during World War II, the Bayreuth Festspielhaus and Wahnfried were frequently visited by he whose name shall not be mentioned, as my cousin would like to say, but I'll mention his name, Adolf Hitler, himself an avid admirer of Wagner. And you heard Stephen Fry say how difficult it was to share such an intense experience with someone whom you so much detest. The Festspielhaus was festooned with Nazi imagery to celebrate his birthday. That was Wahnfried organised that. And that's what it looked like. And if you look at this, you'll see that superimposed on how it looks. So that's what it looked like. That's what it looks like now, and that's what was done to it. It's the same building, and obviously they didn't paint everything black and white, but you can see what elaborate festooning of the hall was done in honour of Hitler's visit.
April 20th, 1939 was Hitler's 50th birthday. Wahnfried decorated the opera house and prepared a special present for him. Original scores by Richard Wagner. The Rheingold and the Valkyrie. They were later lost forever in the final days of the war. While the 1939 festival was taking place, Germany was preparing to attack Poland. This was Hitler's war, planned long ago. Wahnfried was afraid.
As soon as people started shooting and dropping bombs on each other, she completely lost her nerve. From that time on, she never went to Berlin again, where things might be dangerous. And she didn't meet Hitler once after that.
In 1940, Wahnfried Wagner visited Paris on an official mission. Major figures of the German opera gave a concert to celebrate victory over their defeated enemy. There had to be music to accompany the occupation, the Master Singers, directed by von Karajan. It was a musical finale to a 6-week blitzkrieg campaign. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were defeated surprisingly quickly. On the front and at home, Hitler was cheered as the greatest general of all time. The world of opera did not want to be left out. But Winifred's joy was muted. Hitler appeared to have abandoned her. The great general no longer had time for her. He attended the festival a final time in 1940, while bathing in the deceptive glory of victory over France.
In 1945, the living room with its rotunda and guest room located on the side and rear of the house were destroyed by Allied bombing, along with between 1 and 2/3 of the rest of Bayreuth. I can't get an exact figure for that because some people say 1/3, some people say 2/3, someone says half, so it was a lot. Books, paintings and archives had been secured beforehand, as I mentioned, in the basement of the Wahnfried Wagner hospital. However, a Gestapo official stopped her from removing historic furnishings such as Wagner's writing desk, accusing her of defeatism. As a result, these were destroyed in the bombing. Given that the war was all but over, that Bayreuth represented little in the way of military threat, and many prisoners were killed in the process. So on the Allied side, bombing of Bayreuth has been called vindictive cultural bombing. Here's what happened to Wahnfried. You can see the corner of the house is completely obliterated. Because of the far-sightedness of Winifred, she'd taken all the stuff out, and the piano had been secured. In fact, all the pianos were saved, all the books were saved, and the remaining furnishings, such as his writing materials, they just left them there because the Gestapo said, "We're not going to lose the war, don't be defeatist." There you go, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? It's interesting when you look at, just see if you can remember what you see there, the shape of the side of the house and what was done to safeguard it. It stayed like that for quite some time. Now here you'll see different aspects of the wreckage. You can see there's that lattice thing on the right that is still there. And then you see American GIs looking at the damage. Now up there you can see the ceiling has survived, enough of it for them to be able to model the rest of the restoration on. So because that was there, they were able to simply copy it. And notice the empty bookshelves. All the books have been secured. Winifred had taken them off the shelf. So that's why the next photographs I'll show you will see the books back on the shelves. Now, I'm sure you know who those two are, Wolfgang and Wieland. They look very friendly and sibling joined at the hip, but actually they seem to be better rather than Wieland was director of the festival before Wolfgang, and Wolfgang I think didn't take that well, and some quite vindictive stuff happened afterwards, which you'll hear Nikki talking about in a minute. Here is Siegfried surveying the repairs to the house. Now at this point you can see that they plastered over. They didn't attempt to rebuild the demolished part, they just built a wall over where it had been destroyed. So the part where he's standing now is where there was building before. And if you look at that window, and that window is still there. See the two little windows on the right-hand side? On the left-hand side, you see a sort of, well, you see on the left-hand side, the old part of the house. To the right is all that got destroyed. Now, what they had done was, what Siegfried did eventually was to build a little kind of pretend rotunda there to replace the one that had originally been there. There was no upper story, and he put bigger windows in on the right-hand side. Remember the ones before, like that? No, he's put taller windows in there. This is the house he eventually moved into. That was called, for some reason, Siegfried's house. And to this day it's still there. In fact, Winifred lived there until her death. His widow. No. Upon Wieland's death in 1966, Wahnfried ceased to be a dwelling. After Wieland's brother, Wolfgang Wagner, had the house measured and asked his widow, Wieland's widow, Gertrude, the Racing she was born as, to pay rent, thereby forcing her to move out with her children. And hear her telling that in her own words.
After the death of my father, his younger brother Wolfgang, my uncle, became the boss. He had a right, therefore, to move into Wahnfried, the family house. But he already had his own house where he had lived for a long time. So what did this mean for us? Wolfgang arrived to measure all the rooms where we lived, to work out what we should pay in rent. How high should the rent be? He knew very well that Wieland's widow, our mother, had no money. Indeed, there were enormous debts. We had all just started our studies. There was an obvious lack of money. We just couldn't afford any rent.
Wolfgang not only evicted us, but he then sacked all the people in the Festspielhaus connected to my father. He destroyed the scenery designed by my father, and worse, all the little models he had made. He burned the complete correspondence between my father and the various artists. And this time it wasn't a book burning, but a letter burning.
It felt like a vendetta against the whole of Wieland's family.
Everything that had to do with my father was hacked to pieces. He put my family out in the street, and later, when he himself took up with a younger woman, his own wife was thrown out. And his two children, Gottfried and Eva, found their nursery furniture and toys in the yard. He just said either pick them up or they will be sent to the rubbish tip. He did that even to his own children.
You can see no love lost there. From 1953, that was when Wolfgang had been settled in a house next to the Festspielhaus, so he didn't really need to move into Wahnfried. But you would think if he wanted this right of succession, he might have taken the opportunity to do that. And measuring the house suggested he didn't want to do that, he wanted them to pay rent. But knowing that they had no money, it seems quite a vindictive thing to do. Winifred remained in Siegfried's house until her death in 1980. In 1973, Wolfgang and Winifred gifted Wahnfried to the city of Bayreuth, since no one was living in it. Then over the next 3 years, the war and weather-damaged parts of the house were restored to their original state, with the recreation of the rotunda, salon and guest room. So the official inauguration of the Richard Wagner Museum in Bayreuth was able to go ahead as planned in 1976, and this is the thing in process of being repaired. See on the left-hand side, they're just putting the rotunda back together again. And it's such a remarkable job, you absolutely can't tell it's not original. It's like a lot of the jet restoration that went on in Vienna and across Germany. And you can see why they want to heal the terrible wounds inflicted. So it's a fantastic job, and hats off to them. A stylized version of the Villa Wahnfried was used for the sets of Stefan Herrheim's new production of Parsifal at the Bayreuth Festival in 2008. You can see there. So that, believe it or not, that's not actually the house. It's a set. Looks like the house. So nice work there. Now the house was closed again in 2010 for extensive restoration and renovation at a cost of 20 million euros, which, as you know, would take me all day to make that money. And there it is in the process of being repaired. A lot of work was done at this point because they excavated below the property to put in the downstairs rooms, which you can now see the sets and costumes and so on from Wagner's time, and actually original plans. Here's the excavation and process. You see they've actually excavated right down below the front of the house, and eventually they, of course, cover that over. And now when you visit the museum, you're going into that area to see these things that we'll see in a minute. And on the 26th of July 2015, there was a grand reopening of the villa with archive rooms, as you see, and the new pavilion that you already saw in the panoramic video from the graves. Along with the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, Wahnfried has become a shrine for admirers of Wagner. Visitors can take a walk legally now in the remote Hofgarten. It's no longer got the count stopping the Wagners from getting in. You can go in yourself and just walk through it. In fact, this is photographs that I took from my visit there. The following images I'm going to show you are the ones that Reza Kolosi and I took during our we took advantage of the tickets that we could get through the society. So, needless to say, that was a visit of a lifetime. And I'll walk you through them. There's the part of the grounds of the Hofgarten. That's the person keeps showing up. That's the entrance. If you can see the rotunda right on the other side there, the back of the house. And the entrance, main entrance. This is the entrance to the back. And the fountain's still there. That's Teresa looking at the wall. This is what in the downstairs you can just see. These are the costumes from the actual productions from the day, from Wagner's time. And they're in remarkably good condition. And it was just fantastic. They never bombed the Festspielhaus. Imagine what that would have done. And there's the model for the Festspielhaus and the orchestra pit you can see going through the top view. This is all on display. Now these are the books. Remember I showed you the empty bookshelves? Well, here now you see the books there, and you see the original paintings that were up on the wall out back where they were. And there's the ceiling. It's not fully painted up as the ones that you see in the old monochrome photos, but still, there it is. And I know you know who that's. La Belle Dame sans Merci is. And if we have a look close up at what the titles of the books are, you'll see Schopenhauer on there somewhere, I think. Yes, Schopenhauer, Leben, is the life of Schopenhauer. I believe you can see that. Another aspect of the books. These are obviously staple reading material. This is from the upstairs where the bedrooms were for the children. Wagner's writing study was up there. And these rooms are no longer preserved as bedrooms. They're now museum rooms. So you don't any longer go into places being lived in or had recently been lived in. And that's the same entrance. That door there, the doors you see there, the double doors, the composition piano wasn't there for some reason. Remember I showed you before, it was on the left-hand side. But if you walk through there now, you go into the salon, the grand salon. Now, my eyesight is good enough to see what that score is. I think it might be Flying Dutchman. But all these autographs, that's the original score of Wagner's hand. As you heard, Nicky, was it Nicky? Was it said it? It was in that American film when Wahnfried gave Rheingold and what was the other one? Valkyrie gave them to Hitler. They got burned. So fortunately, they'd been copied beforehand. As it would be a demi-ring. There's Schopenhauer again. Happy chap. His cheerful mood. This is Wagner's day wear. So it's the sort of things you walk around with in the street, I guess. Theatrical. This is Cosima's day wear. I think they're quite people about town. That's a mirror, which actually you can see. We pretended it was a portrait of that had been on the desk with me and Rhythm. And this is another model of the Festspielhaus. And some of the adornments that we used in the original productions of the 1876 production of the Ring. And so they've survived and are on display. Wagner's sofa, you see, must have sat on that one a lot. It's well worn and well creased. So, and that's one of the robes from the production of Parsifal. I'll show you which year that is from. But you can always find out if you go over there and ask them. Now this is an example of the chairs that we used in the Festspielhaus, because the Festspielhaus, as anyone who's been there knows, it's quite uncomfortable. You used to take cushions with you. And they make their money out of what they don't make out of the €300 per opera fees, they make out of the €1 per cushion fee. And you have to have at least 2 cushions. So, they actually look, to me, nicer than the chairs in there, don't you think, Dale?
Yeah.
And another of the plans for the Festspielhaus that's on display there. And this is, we've already seen who that is. They seem to have given them quite a private place, and they're very, apparently they did quite a bit of sort of photoshopping of the image in the day. Not necessarily as pretty as that in real life. This is another score I can't actually see from here. Oh, that's what it says. Yes. So busy looking at the score, trying to work out what it was, then I could just look at the instructions. And all else fails to read the manual. This is Cosima's diary. That's what it looked like, original diary. Opened out so she would write these double, fully laid out pages, and meticulous detail, day to day. Is fantastic. So that's the source of all the printed versions of the diary. There are actually 2 volumes that thick of diaries, and the first one I think goes about 1866 and then 1867 till their death. Letter from Wagner to Franz Liszt. I don't suppose he thought when he was writing the letter, oh, I'm going to write a letter to Franz Liszt, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to put it on display in a museum. They'd be just writing the letter, wouldn't they? They wouldn't be thinking about people putting it up on a notice board in a museum in a part of a house that was bombed in a war, which they wouldn't have even foreseen. But there it is. There's a letter to Franz Liszt. And this is a very remarkable part of the underground part of the pavilion, of the museum. And you'll see in a minute, I'm going to show you the score playing. So this is what the score actually looks like. You go in there and you see what looks like a sheet of paper, then you can turn the page over, and it's got the actual autograph of, I'm not sure if it's autograph, I'll put a bit more closely, it's just...
What's those white bits?
Sorry?
The white bits.
You'll see that in a second when it starts moving. Here it is. I found that intensely overwhelming to stand there in that room, darkened, and to see that score moving past and hear music playing on fantastic quality equipment. I'll show you another one. Let's do it straight up. See, look at that. When you think about that, it's a sheet of paper, well, virtual paper, rolling past, and someone with imagination and a pen put a dot on the page, and I made a timpani go, bam! Oh, rub that up. No tip. Bam! Bam! Just a single act of putting a dot on the page. One of my clients is sitting here, knows all about this, Peter Orbison, sat next to me doing orchestration. We didn't have this though, did we, Pete?
No, it's a very nice, great illustration.
Sure is, and I think that's it. Have your delusions found peace? Oh, it's another 4 hours, I forgot. That's the 4th night. In fact, when I prepared Rebecca for my own opera, I took it to Professor Nigel Osborne, who was very experienced at writing operas. And he looked at my 83-page A3 double-sided libretto and said, with all seriousness and maybe a little bit of mockery, he said, I think we should put this on over 5 nights. So no, I don't want them to come back for the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. I want to do it in 1 night. So he said, well, just start writing music and the libretto will sort itself out, you'll realise. And after I'd written set a paragraph to music, it was a half an hour, and I realised I was only not even down the side of 1 page. So yes, Wagner wrote his own libretti, of course, and set them to music. So, are there any questions? Pete, it has to be something I know the answer to.
No, that I'm intrigued. What's the reference? Delusions and my delusions have found peace. Is that what was the name of? Why did he choose the name, that very specific name for his house?
Well, I think
is it a reference to one of the operas? Or?
It's not a reference to an opera. It's a reference to his state of mind. And I think he at various times felt when he would write that he was deluded. He wondered whether he was tempting fate. He would say, like there's letters to the king saying, cancel this, cancel, it's all cancelled. And very melodramatic, throwing down the handbag sort of language. And
handbag?
No, I'm just romancing it for you. I think it was simply that it had come to rest that he'd found home. And I think that if you look at his life at Tribschen, where he had family and children, and you see him with the children, you see that there's very much a part of him that wants that. But when you see the quest for the home, the hall of the slain and the hall of the honoured in battle, it's kind of both, I think. You look at Wahnfried, you think he won the battle with debt, he won the battle with the government in some kind of way by them letting him back into the country, if that's winning anything, being allowed back in. Well, he won that. And he certainly won notability forever, really. Yes, as for Delusions, I think it's probably just a turn of phrase. I think it's just something he just thought of saying and put it up there. Certainly because, if you, I do recommend Derek Watson's book to you, by the way. It's got a lot more detail than you find in other biographies. And he tells us in a lot of detail about how much amusement it caused in the town, and Wagner named it that.
Delusion, by definition, is a false belief. You believe something that's false.
Yes,
by definition, what a delusion is. Yeah.
But I should have probably researched that in more detail, to be honest. So I'll look it up. And you can Google the answer. I'll attach to the end.
Okay. No rush. Tomorrow will be fine.
So I'm free tomorrow. Well, not free, but cheap.
That was the first and only house he ever owned.
Yes.
As he lived in grace and favour of others for effectively all his life until so that's partly the peace that he's not going to be evicted.
Right, it could be the angle.
I think the house he was born in Leipzig, there's a plaque there, but I think it's a warehouse now, isn't there?
It's a shopping centre.
Yeah.
So this shopping centre,
red and white line, I think.
Yes, but etched as part of the planning consent, they have etched the facade of the house in Brula, which you can't see because it's quite a narrow street.
Yeah.
But at certain points you can actually see the facade of the original house.
Right. So any other observations, comments? Yes.
Yeah. Well, a couple of comments. If you take Derek Watson's translation as illusions rather than delusions, that makes more sense.
It does, yeah.
Second comment is you said that Wolfgang succeeded Wieland as artistic director of the festival. That's not actually true. They were both joint artistic directors. Wieland got the house as the oldest son.
That's right, yes, sorry.
But they were joint artistic directors until Wieland died, and then Wolfgang became the sole artistic
director. There's a book called The Wagner Clan, which describes that a little bit differently.
I think Wieland in his will actually left it to Wolfgang, though, did he not? In the early 60s, it was ascertained that they actually did leave it.
No, it all comes from Siegfried's will.
Yeah.
Who got what was in Siegfried's will, and everything comes from that, right down to when Wolfgang disposed of the Festspielhaus to the Bavarian government.
Yes, that was it. I think the argument Wolfgang had was that Wieland and Wolfgang had an agreement that when Wieland died, that Wolfgang himself would take over. I think that was the early 60s. I think it was like an agreement in inverted commas or something.
Well, nobody knew that Wieland was going to die.
Yeah.
I mean, that was very, very sudden.
Yeah.
It could have gone forever. Anyway, that's comment.
Well, thank you. I'll look into that again, because I remember reading in Jonathan Carr's book, The Wagner Clan. Pretty sure you might recall that, was that it wasn't quite like that, but I'll look into that and set the record straight, and I put this online.
A question is, you said that the Parsifal was performed in Munich for the king's satisfaction.
In the palace for the king.
Right, so
8 times.
Right, because I'd always thought it was only performed at Bayreuth until the ban was broken by the Met.
Yes,
in New
I'm not
York.
sure I found this. I've researched using the accepted terms on this, including Derek Watson. Although I didn't look that up, wasn't in his book. I couldn't be able to tell you all the books I looked it up. And by the way, when I'm thinking of books, actually there's a couple of errors I found in here. They said in one place that Wagner was 5 years at that last hotel in Venice, but it's actually 5 months, obviously. But other than that, I didn't find any of that stood out. But this is a very Dale recommended it to me, and I strongly can strongly recommend it to you. It's full of photos. In fact, some of the things I actually, for this talk, I got from here. So there you go, it's I think about 40 quid or something. It's money well spent.
So were these 8 performances of Parsifal at Munich private performances for,
Yes,
just for the king?
For the king, yeah.
Right.
And he had 48 operas altogether, and 28 of them were Wagner's. That he put on. Imagine that. You just think, so I'd like to have an opera of Wagner put on. Get it together. Wouldn't you like to?
And sole audience was one person.
Yes, he was in. Sometimes he'd have a pal there.
Wow. That's.
He didn't like the public looking at him, watching the show. They'd be looking at him and he'd be watching the show.
It's like Caligula or something. That's it.
So any other contributions?
Yes. Yeah, just I think at the beginning of the talk, you're listening about the one of your aims of the talk was to kind of sort of show how Wahnfried may have been sort of modelled on Valhalla. What are your
when you look at the entrance,
thoughts on that? Yeah.
When you look at the entrance to at the very when I played the scene, it's quite powerful. Well, when the Valhalla is built, and you see the entrance there, you can almost imagine looking at Wahnfried. The very imposing front entrance, almost you get the feeling that. Who knows what the production was, by the way? Very good.
Yes.
Patrice Schurrer. There was a Schurrer production.
Which, if anything, is based on Wahnfried, and not the other way around.
Yes. Yes. So when you look at that, you think you're seeing Wahnfried. Not that Wagner had any say in that, of course, he was no longer alive at that point. Well and truly not, but it seemed to me that it's an open question, to be honest. I don't think that you could say that when I look at what Valhalla is, it's a mortuary for the fallen who distinguished themselves in battle. Well, Wagner put his grave in his own property and planned his death and planned his dynasty, so his son would live here, and so he's planning the dynasty. So it does seem to me that it's not just a regular house where you have a shed out the back and mum and dad and 2.2 kids in a dog called Spot.
The image of Wotan or Odin. Well, I don't know if it's original, that if it goes way back, but what it's depicting is Odin receiving knowledge, because there's 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, represent thought and memory, and they would give him the knowledge of the day, almost like you're checking the news in the morning. BBC News 24 is receiving knowledge as an example of knowledge coming to him and him then deciding what to do. I don't know if it's. I've often thought, as I have been debated, whether that survived. That image, if it's original, I didn't ask in the museum.
I've seen a few effects. If you go into the Wiki Commons page, you'll find images depicting that. The Norse legends are showing that.
Yes,
I was thinking of putting into this, but I thought I was going to run past the deadline. I think, by the looks of John, are we near the end of our... No. So any other contributions, things you'd like to... Doesn't have to be a question.
Something like that. Those scores that got burned, you said that they were copied.
Sorry.
Were they transcribed or were they somehow photographed?
Yeah, that would have been published, I think, by then.
Yes.
By the time in the war, that would have been on bookshelves somewhere.
But it was Wagner's manuscript that was destroyed.
Actually, yes.
Do you reckon that the Russians have got them in their archive?
No,
Rheinsy was taken as well, the original of Rheinsy, which is fundamental because they kept changing his mind, Wagner, when he kept coming back to it throughout his life. So there's no, if you see a performance of Rheinsy nowadays, you don't know if it's a very, very original way of doing it. I think Fairies was there as well, the original of Fairies. But but the Russians probably have them in their archive.
Well, that is a possibility. They just disappeared.
Yeah.
Winifred did ask for them back as Berlin was being bombed.
I think some of the kids were going over there trying to get hold of them.
Yeah, some of them certainly visited and pleaded with Hitler.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I must draw this discussion to a close. I'm sure you will agree that we've had a splendid evening of scholarship this evening. We've heard all about Richard Wagner's life, his music, and in particular his architectural heritage as exemplified by Wahnfried, and how this affected his life and his music, and how it affected him also. So thank you very much, Derek, for a wonderful evening of scholarship and entertainment.
Thank you.
We'll reconvene again in October. You'll be getting news of our programme in the newsletter, which you'll all get, at least those of you who are members. But we'll be starting again in October with an exciting programme, and look forward to welcoming you on there. Thank you again.